Evening. A grand charity gala inside a luxury New York hotel. Crystal chandeliers, soft jazz, and shimmering gowns fill the room. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, walks in wearing an old but neat suit. He is alone. No date, no famous name. Some guests whisper, "He looks out of place." Daniel doesn't react. He is here for his daughter's school fundraiser. But as he enters the main hall, a group of wealthy guests laugh. "Came alone? That's bold." Daniel stands frozen. Then, a man walks up and stands beside him. He says clearly, he is not alone. Now, watch, listen, truth. Daniel Brooks was a man of quiet iron and rhythmic labor. At 41, his face was a map of weary resilience and honest sweat, etched with the subtle lines of a man who understood the skeletal strength of the city. He was a senior maintenance technician for a massive residential complex, the guy who kept the pipes from bursting and the elevators moving while the rest of the world slept. He was the invisible anchor, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with the faint, honest shadows of motor oil and industrial soap. He knew the internal heartbeat of a skyscraper better than the architects who drew them. To Daniel, logic and physics were the only things that never lied. But Daniel's life wasn't measured in wrenches or voltage meters. It was measured in the success of his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma was a phenomenon, a bright, empathetic child who had won a full academic scholarship to the street, Jude Academy, one of the most prestigious and expensive private schools in Manhattan. For Daniel, a single father who had lost his wife, Sarah, to a sudden illness 5 years ago, Emma was more than just a daughter. She was a miracle he was determined to protect. He spent his nights studying advanced algebra just so he could help her with her homework, and his weekends were dedicated to building complex science projects out of recycled parts from the workshop. The gala tonight was the school's annual Starlight fundraiser. It was a mandatory social event for parents, a high-stakes environment where multi-million-dollar donations were pledged over tiny glasses of vintage champagne. Daniel had initially planned to stay home. He knew he didn't belong in a room full of hedge fund managers and tech titans. He didn't have a tuxedo that cost more than his car, and he certainly didn't have a power partner to walk in with. He felt like a rough sketch in a gallery of finished masterpieces. "Dad, you have to go," Emma had said that morning, her small hands carefully adjusting his collar while he sat at their small, scratched kitchen table. "The teachers said it's about the community. You're my community. You're the best person I know. Just show them you're there for me. It's not about the money, it's about being present." Daniel couldn't say no to her. He had spent the last week carefully preparing, treating the event like a mission. He didn't have the money for a new suit, so he had taken his only one, the navy wool suit he had worn to his wife's funeral, to a local dry cleaner. He polished his heavy work boots until they shone like glass, their scuffs hidden by layers of wax. He cut his hair himself in the bathroom mirror, ironed his white shirt with surgical precision, and mentally practiced his polite listening face. He was a soldier of the working class, preparing to enter a battlefield of silk and ego. As he pulled his modest silver sedan into the line of Ferraris and Rolls-Royces at the hotel entrance, he felt a sharp, familiar pang of anxiety. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked neat, clean, and entirely unremarkable. To the world of the New York elite, he was a ghost. He was the man who arrived through the service entrance to fix a leak, not the man who walked through the front door to sign a check. He stepped out of the car, the cool evening air carrying the scent of expensive cigars and city exhaust. He walked into the lobby, his hands in his pockets to hide the slight, involuntary tremor of his fingers. The air smelled of jasmine and expensive coldness. The music was a soft, sophisticated backdrop to the sound of million-dollar deals being discussed in hushed tones. Daniel checked his invitation at the gilded podium. The woman behind the desk looked at his suit, noting the dated cut, then his shoes, and then back at the list. Her smile was a practiced mask that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Brooks, table 42, in the back, near the terrace doors, through the grand archway and to the left." Daniel nodded, his face a mask of professional calm. He didn't care about the table placement. He was there for Emma. He was there to fulfill a promise. He began to walk toward the main ballroom, unaware that the community Emma believed in was currently sharpening its knives for the only person in the room who didn't have a corporate title. He was about to enter a den of lions, armed with nothing but the integrity of a man who worked for every cent he owned. He didn't know that his silence was about to become the loudest sound in the hotel. He was the foundation of the building, standing among the people who only cared about the view from the penthouse. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp, expensive wool. As Daniel moved through the crowd, he felt the invisible wall of social class pressing against him. People didn't just ignore him. They moved around him like he was a glitch in a perfect simulation, a smudge on a high-definition screen. He reached table 42, a small, circular table tucked into a dim corner behind a massive floral arrangement. It was a scholarship table, a place for the parents who were there by invitation of merit, not of wealth. It felt more like a waiting room for a job interview than a gala. He sat alone. His table mates hadn't arrived yet, and most likely wouldn't. He watched the room with the clinical eye of a technician. He saw the performative empathy of the wealthy, the way they toasted to education for all, while physically recoiling from the man in the dry-clean navy suit. He noticed the way they checked their watches, the way they spoke over each other, and the way no one ever actually looked at the waiter serving them. Near the center of the room, a group of high-profile parents were holding court. One of them was Julian Sterling, a venture capitalist whose son was in Emma's class. Julian was a man who measured the world in percentages, leverage, and social capital. He was 38, wore a watch that cost more than Daniel's house, and prided himself on disrupting every room he entered. He noticed Daniel sitting in the corner, and a slow, mocking smile spread across his face, like a predator spotting a weak link in the chain. "Check the corner, boys," Julian whispered to his associates, loud enough for a nearby waiter to hear. "It looks like the merit-based crowd actually showed up. Is that a suit or a historical artifact from the 80s? I didn't know the dry cleaners still worked on fabrics that heavy." Shallow laughs rippled through the group. A woman in a dress that glittered with actual diamonds leaned in, her eyes sharp. "Came alone? That's bold for an event like this. Most people bring a publicist just to survive the seating chart. He looks like he's waiting for a bus that's never coming. Does he think they're serving beer and burgers later?" Daniel heard every word. The acoustics of the ballroom were perfect, a cruel irony for someone who wanted to be invisible. He didn't turn his head. He didn't flush with anger. He picked up a glass of water and took a steady, deliberate sip. He remembered Emma's drawing on the refrigerator, a picture of a tall lighthouse standing strong against a massive dark wave. "That's you, Dad," she had written in her messy script. He wasn't going to let a man in a silk tie knock him over. The mockery continued, growing louder as the vintage champagne flowed and the egos expanded. Julian eventually wandered toward the back, ostensibly to check the weather on the terrace, but he stopped right next to Daniel's table. He stood there, invading Daniel's space, the scent of his expensive cologne clashing with the smell of floor wax. "Excuse me," Julian said, his tone dripping with a condescending irony. "I think there's been a mistake. The service staff usually eats in the basement after the event is over. Are you sure you're at the right table, pal? Table 42 is for donors, and I don't recall seeing your firm in the quarterly reports or the benefactor list." Daniel looked up. He didn't look down at his hands. He met Julian's gaze with a steady, unblinking clarity that seemed to catch the wealthy man off guard. There was no fear in Daniel's eyes, only a quiet, weary patience. "I'm here as a parent, Mr. Sterling. My firm is Brooks Maintenance. We deal in structural integrity. We make sure the things that look pretty actually stay standing. If you ever have a leak in your foundation or a crack in your ego, give me a call. I'm quite good at finding the faults." Julian's face tightened. He didn't like the lack of submission in the man's eyes. He didn't like that a nobody was using his own language against him. Structural integrity? Listen to this guy. He's the plumber for the scholarship kids. Listen, Brooks, these events aren't really for everyone. They're for people who can actually move the needle. You're just taking up a seat that could have gone to a real benefactor. You're a guest in our world. Try to act like it. The people at the surrounding tables stopped talking. They watched the confrontation with a mix of amusement and cold indifference. Daniel was completely isolated in the middle of 1,000 lights. He was a man standing in a palace, being told he was an intruder in his own daughter's future. He felt the weight of their judgment like a physical pressure, a suffocating vacuum of elitism that tried to make him feel small. He thought about leaving. He thought about walking out into the New York night and never looking back. But then he remembered Emma's face when she straightened his tie. He realized that if he walked away now, he was teaching her that the bullies own the room. He was the anchor, and the anchor doesn't move just because the tide gets rough. He sat back, his posture perfect, his hands relaxed on the table. "The needle moves in many ways, Julian," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying a resonance that silenced the table next to them. "Sometimes it moves through a checkbook, and sometimes it moves through the people we raise. My seat is paid for by my daughter's hard work and her refusal to be average. That makes it the most expensive seat in the room. You can't buy that with a donation." Julian let out a harsh barking laugh, his face turning a mottled red. "The most expensive? You're delusional. Someone calls security before he starts asking for a tip or tries to fix the dishwasher." But before Julian could wave a hand for the manager, the heavy dark oak doors at the front of the ballroom swung wide. The orchestra stopped playing for a split second, then transitioned into a respectful, low-tempo melody. The air in the room didn't just change, it solidified. The person everyone had been waiting for, the man who funded the school's entire endowment and owned the building across the street, had arrived. And he wasn't looking at the stage or the VIP section. He was looking at the back of the room. He was looking for the foundation. Richard Langford didn't just walk, he moved with the gravity of a planet. At 55, Langford was one of the 10 wealthiest men in the city, a philanthropist and industrialist whose name was engraved on hospitals, libraries, and the very foundation of the St. Jude Academy. He was the guest of honor, the man whom Julian Sterling had been desperately trying to corner for 6 months to pitch a new speculative investment fund. Richard was the kind of man whose whisper could end a career or start a revolution. Richard scanned the room, his eyes sharp and observant behind his thin-rimmed glasses. He ignored the VPs and the socialites who tried to intercept him with practiced smiles. He ignored the general manager who rushed forward with a fresh glass of water. He walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes fixed on table 42 in the far dim corner. Julian Sterling, seeing Langford approaching his direction, straightened his blazer and put on his most charismatic, billionaire-friendly smile. He assumed Langford was coming to the terrace for a private moment, or perhaps to greet Julian himself after seeing him stand out in the crowd. "Mr. Langford," Julian chirped, stepping into the aisle to block the path with an outstretched hand. "What an honor. I was just telling our guests here about your recent expansion into the sustainable energy sector. Truly visionary work, sir. I'd love to discuss my new fund with you." Richard Langford didn't stop. He didn't even look at Julian. He simply stepped around him as if he were a piece of misplaced, slightly annoying furniture. He walked straight to the small, dim table in the corner and stopped directly beside Daniel Brooks. The entire ballroom went deathly silent. The clink of silverware against porcelain stopped. The whispers vanished. The socialites froze with glasses halfway to their lips. "He is not alone," Richard Langford said. The words weren't loud, but they carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate the crystal chandeliers above. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact that rewrote the hierarchy of the evening in a single breath. The invisible man had just been made visible by the most powerful sun in the sky. Julian Sterling stood frozen, his hand still extended for a handshake that would never happen. "Mr. Langford, I apologize. I didn't realize you knew." The technician. "I was just ensuring the table was appropriate for the event." Richard turned his head slowly toward Julian. His gaze was like liquid nitrogen, cold, clear, and utterly devastating. "The technician? Is that how you refer to the man who raised the top-ranked student in this entire academy? Because I refer to him as the person who is teaching the rest of us what a real father looks like. I refer to him as my colleague in the only work that actually matters." Richard reached out and placed a firm, respectful hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Daniel, good to see you again. I apologize for being late. The board meeting in London ran long, and the weather over the Atlantic was uncooperative." Daniel stood up, his heart pounding against his ribs, but his face remaining steady. He was just as surprised as Julian, but he recognized the man immediately. He hadn't seen him in a custom suit before. He had seen him in a worn-out baseball cap, a gray t-shirt, and cargo pants, standing at the back of the school's robotics lab at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Mr. Langford," Daniel said, his voice level and resonant. "It's good to see you. I didn't realize you were the keynote speaker tonight. I thought you were just the guy who knew a lot about circuit boards." "I'm just the guy who signs the checks, Daniel," Richard smiled, a real, genuine smile that he hadn't shown to anyone else in the room. "You're the guy who actually does the work. You're the one who taught my son that a robot is only as good as the logic of the person building it." The crowd was reeling. A multi-millionaire was treating a nobody with more respect than the CEO of a venture capital firm. The guests who had snickered earlier were now looking at each other in terror, trying to remember if their laughter had been loud enough to be heard by the man standing in the corner. Julian Sterling looked like he wanted to dissolve into the carpet. "You know him?" a woman from the front row asked, her voice high with disbelief. Richard looked out at the sea of tuxedos and gowns, his expression turning serious. "Do I know him? I've spent the last 6 months watching this man, every Tuesday and Thursday, while most of you were at happy hours, golf clubs, or checking your stock portfolios. Daniel was sitting in the school library. He wasn't just helping his daughter, he was helping 3 other scholarship students, including my own son, prepare for the national physics competition. I know him because he's the only parent who offered to fix the lab's failing ventilation system for free when the school budget was tied up in red tape. He didn't ask for a plaque. He didn't ask for a tax write-off. He just wanted the kids to be able to breathe while they worked." He looked back at Julian Sterling. "Julian, you spend a lot of time talking about moving the needle. Well, Daniel moves the world. He does it quietly, without an audience, and without a PR team. He raises a child who has more character in her little finger than this entire ballroom has in its bank accounts. He is the standard, not the exception." Richard turned to the waiter who was hovering nearby. "I believe there's been a mistake with the seating. I don't want to sit at the head table. I'd like another chair brought to table 42. I think I'll spend my evening in the best company in the room. The view from the back is much clearer." The general manager scrambled to comply, personally carrying a velvet chair to the back corner. Richard Langford sat down next to Daniel Brooks, and for the first time that night, table 42 was the center of the universe. The Ice Queen Gala had just been hit by a tidal wave of truth, and the man in the dry-cleaned navy suit was the only one still standing tall. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from cold to electrified. The scheduled speeches began, but no one was listening to the teleprompter. They were all watching the back table. They were watching the most powerful man in the city lean in to listen to a maintenance technician talk about the best way to teach a child resilience through failure. It was a masterclass in leadership that wasn't on the program. During the main course, Richard Langford stood up to give his scheduled address. He didn't use notes. He didn't talk about profit margins or the school's expansion. He looked directly at the parents in the room, his voice echoing with a new kind of intensity. "Tonight is about the future," Richard began, his gaze sweeping the room. "But we've been looking at the future through the wrong lens. We think the future is built by those who have the most resources. But I've learned something this year at St. Jude. I've been watching a student named Emma Brooks, and I've been watching her father." Daniel sat in the shadows of the corner, his hands gripped tight on the tablecloth. He hadn't expected his daughter's name to be spoken on that stage. He felt a surge of protectiveness, then a surge of pride. "Emma is a scholarship student," Richard continued, "and some of you might think that makes her a guest in this community. But I've seen Emma stay after class every single day for 2 months. Not to study for herself. She already has the highest GPA in the school, but to tutor 3 of her classmates who were struggling with calculus. 2 of those classmates are the children of people sitting in this room tonight. You know who you are?" He paused, letting the heavy silence sink in. "Emma doesn't do it for extra credit. She doesn't do it because she's being paid by a private tutoring firm. She does it because she was raised by a man who taught her that a person's value is measured by how much they help the person standing next to them. That doesn't happen by accident. That isn't a result of wealth. That is a result of elite parenting. Richard looked toward Daniel. Daniel Brooks didn't need $1 million to raise someone remarkable. He used his time. He used his integrity. He used his presence. He showed her that being a hero means showing up when no one is watching. And tonight, I've seen some of you treat him as if he didn't belong here. I want to tell you something. If this school loses a parent like Daniel, it loses its soul. We don't need more donors who only care about the name on the wall. We need more fathers who care about the character in the halls. The room was stunned into a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people who were actually looking at their own reflections and finding them wanting. They looked at their expensive suits and realized they were hollow. One of the parents whose child Emma had tutored, a woman who had pointedly ignored Daniel earlier, stood up and began to clap. Slowly, tentatively, the rest of the room followed. It wasn't a polite, rhythmic clap. It was a standing ovation for the man in the corner who had been invisible an hour ago. Richard walked back to the table, ignoring the applause. He looked at Daniel and whispered, "I hope you don't mind the spotlight, Daniel. Sometimes the light needs to find the right person, so everyone else can see the path." Daniel gave a small, humble nod, his eyes shimmering with a rare emotion. "I just want her to be proud of me, Richard. That's the only goal I have." "She already is," Richard replied, his voice firm, "and so am I. You remind me why I started building things in the first place." As the gala continued, the parents who had mocked Daniel earlier began to filter toward his table. They didn't come with mockery. They came with a desperate, sheepish need to be seen talking to him, hoping to erase their earlier behavior. Julian Sterling was nowhere to be found. He had slipped out the terrace doors 20 minutes ago, realizing his speculative fund was dead before it was even pitched. Daniel didn't change his attitude. He was polite, he was steady, and he remained exactly who he was, a father who was there for his daughter. He realized that he wasn't out of place. The room had simply been out of focus for a long time. The gala ended at midnight. As the guests filtered out toward their idling limousines and town cars, Daniel walked toward his old sedan in the far corner of the parking lot. The night air was cool and smelled of the coming rain. He felt a profound sense of peace, not because of the Millionaire's support, but because he had stayed true to the man Sarah had loved. He drove home to their small apartment in Brooklyn. He walked inside and found Emma fast asleep on the sofa, a heavy book on physics resting on her chest. Her small trophy from the robotics competition was sitting on the coffee table, reflecting the streetlights. Daniel sat down beside her and gently brushed a stray hair from her forehead. Emma stirred, opening her eyes with a sleepy, confused smile. "Dad, you're home. How was the big fancy party? Did you meet the general?" Daniel laughed softly, a warm, rich sound that made the small apartment feel like a palace. "It was worth going, pal. Very worth it. And yes, I met the guy in charge. He's a good man. He knows his way around a circuit board." Emma sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Did you feel out of place? I know everyone there is really rich and different. I was worried you'd feel lonely." Daniel took her hand, his calloused palm a safe, warm harbor for her small one. "At first I did. I felt like a ghost in a museum. But then I realized something, Emma. I realized that I was exactly where I needed to be. I was there because of you. And that made me the most important person in the room. The Millionaire told the whole room that you're the best student they've ever had." Emma hugged his neck, burying her face in his suit jacket. "I told you, Dad, you belong anywhere, because you're the one who built the lighthouse." Daniel smiled, looking at the city lights through their window. He realized that the Millionaire hadn't saved him tonight. He had simply held up a mirror to a truth that Daniel had been carrying in his heart all along. Value isn't something you buy with a donation. It's something you build with your life. It's the time you give, the lessons you teach, and the way you stand tall when the world tries to push you down. The story of the single dad at the gala wasn't a story about a hero in a tuxedo. It was a story about the power of a life well lived in the shadows. Daniel Brooks went to sleep that night knowing that he didn't need $1 million to be a giant. He just needed the love of the little girl who thought he already was one. True respect. It isn't found in the height of your office or the numbers in your bank account. It's found in the integrity of your presence and the character of the person you leave behind. Daniel was home, and for the first time in years, the foundation felt absolutely unbreakable. He wasn't just a maintenance man, he was the architect of a soul. True worth is not defined by the environment you stand in, but by the character you carry within it. A person's value is not found in their bank account or the labels on their clothes, but in the integrity of their actions and the depth of their commitment to those they love. Never judge someone by the surface. The quietest person in the room might be the one holding the world together. If you believe that character is more valuable than any bank account, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt out of place because you didn't fit the room? How did you find the strength to stay?